If you could genetically engineer soldiers, would you?
Your genes aren't you, they're part of you.
Aging is now defined not as something which is just natural, but as a disease. And in one sense, it's just a technical problem.
Diseases and illnesses that have plagued humanity since its beginning could disappear.
There are basically two kind of approaches you can have for the future. There's a regulated approach and a market-based approach. But the market isn't interested in ethics. It's interested in desire.
One of the CRISPR startups in the US will take your eggs and you can use gene editing to say, I want this eye color, I want this hair color, I want them to be this height. He said, future generations will look back at us as so barbaric as parents for just letting our children be a genetic roll of the dice.
You will get religious groups who will say you shouldn't play God, and then they might say you shouldn't play God because we're made in God's image and by gene splicing you're somehow marring that image. What does that actually mean?
Are you fearful some of these advancements falling into the wrong hands? Hello and welcome to the Unbelievable Podcast, the show that brings Christians and non-Christians together to debate the topics that matter to all of us. And today we're diving into a fascinating debate on the topic of faith, science, and the future of humanity. What is the future role of religion? This discussion addresses loads of questions about the future. What will be the average life expectancy? In 50 years, will the first cohort of people be arriving to live on Mars? Which diseases will have been eliminated? All these questions. Welcome to Aylesbury High School. Obviously, you know where we are. My first time here. To this discussion between two very clever chaps, Nick Spencer and Sam McKee. And in this session, in this conversation, we'll ask them first of all, briefly, to give a little backstory, your academic credentials. Start with you, Nick.
Yeah, so I studied history and English at university a long time ago. I did a PhD in politics and religion about 10 years ago, and in between that I've been working for a think tank in London, writing and doing talks and that kind of stuff.
Absolutely fantastic. And Sam, obviously some people here will know you, but can you fill in any gaps?
Sure, so I'm Associate Tutor in History and Philosophy of Science at Manchester Metropolitan University. And I'm a research scientist in molecular biology doing a PhD in DNA repair proteins and looking at their role in fixing and preventing cancer at the University of Reading. What else? Last year I had an experiment flown to the International Space Station. That was very exciting. Other than that, you know me from being around here in Aylesbury and popping into your school quite a bit to put on events like this. So good to be here.
Excellent work. Well, let's get straight into it then. We're talking about science and religion, the sort of past, present and future. Now, it's an eternally interesting topic, isn't it? It's something that is never really out of date in terms of debates and conversations. And some people would say, maybe lots of people would think or believe that science and religion are completely at conflict and in conflict. But Nick, I know you don't believe that. So could you start off by giving us an introduction to the past in terms of the overlapping intersection of science and religion?
Right, all of the past. I'll give it a go.
Yeah. Start from the dinosaurs.
Start from the dinosaurs and work forward.
Yeah.
You're right. 2/3 of people in the UK seem to think there's a conflict between science and religion. I wouldn't go all the way to say there's no conflict. I think there are disagreements there. I don't think disagreements are a bad thing. But the popular belief is that the one thing called science and one thing called religion have been at loggerheads for as long as they've been in existence, which is 400 years or so. That is factually not true. First thing to say is that what we understand by science is quite a new thing. It had different words beforehand. It was called natural philosophy or experimental natural philosophy. Religion, as we come to understand it, is a relatively new thing. And for most of that time, so right the way back into the first millennium, but certainly since the scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th and 18th century, those two things rubbed along reasonably well. There were points of disagreement, we'll come on to those. But what happened was, in the 19th century, the beginning of the 19th century, most people who were scientists would have been clergymen. And at the end of the 19th century, they were professional scientists. And what happened in the 19th century was science was professionalised. It changed from being something which was an amateur activity that people tended to do in rectories up and down the country in a few university towns, to the end of the century where it's done by men and by that stage a few women in lab coats in labs. So it was professionalised, and that created a lot of tension. And in the 19th century, that and the development of Darwinism, evolution, and we'll probably come to talk about that, created some tension. And some people wrote histories of science and religion at the end of the century that looked back over the centuries just through the lens of the tension there was at the late 19th century. And because there was tension where they were, they looked back and they thought, there's always been tension. We can read Copernicus and Galileo and Newton and all the other great scientists as examples of this tension. And that myth, which was known as the warfare myth, then passed into the bloodstream, and it's still basically there. In academic circles, people don't hold that anymore, but popular belief is that science, religion, historically, they've always been at odds.
Excellent. So science was initially called natural philosophy, and started off as a hobby for rectors.
Well, before it was a hobby, it was the kind of thing done by rich men who were interested in the way the world worked. People have always been interested in the way the world worked, but it started to become systematised in the 17th century. And the most important aspect of science, which is the experiment, was developed, properly speaking, in the 17th century.
Great. Well, we'll come back to you shortly. Sam, do you want to pour some gravy on that meat?
Well, I guess we're talking about modern science here, aren't we? I mean, you could go back and look at Aristotle kind of systematising nature and say, well, this is sort of the beginnings of something a bit like what would become that. But obviously, Nick will know as well as anyone, you've got long gaps where that's not really being taken very far at all. I think big landmark points here are things like the Bible being translated into English so that everyone can now access it, and having a more fuller understanding of the text and then asking questions and thinking about that. But no disagreement so far.
Oh, that's good. Phew. Now, science and religion, sort of catch-all terms in lots of people's minds. We've started to edge our way towards a definition of science, but maybe in a second, Nick, you could sort of fulfill that for us. Sam, how would you go about even beginning to define the word religion?
I prefer the word worldview to religion, because then it incorporates things like atheism and humanism. I think of it in terms of both the set of glasses that you wear, and that's how you see and interpret the world around you, whether you believe there's a God or not in what you see through those glasses. But it's also, I think, your philosophy. It's the way you think about questions of meaning and purpose and value. And although I don't see science and religion as in conflict, like Nick has said, you might get the odd border skirmish with that in terms of the way I see the world and understand nature and people and how things operate has to fit within this framework that I've got, and you call that religion. I know a lot of my atheist friends wouldn't like their views being called religious, so I'll just stick with worldview.
Yeah, we don't want it to kick off, Sam, for goodness sake. It's interesting though, isn't it? Because I remember being at school a million years ago and being asked whether I was religious, and I would just have said yes, probably, but it needed more sort of separating out in terms of its function, because what do we mean by that? What do we mean by religious? Do you go to church? Do you believe in God? And different religions across the world, of course, would have very different views on what it means to be religious, what it means to believe in God, the nature of God. So it's interesting. What I'm trying to do, I suppose, is to stop us from simply lumping every religious or scientific view under that slightly crowded umbrella.
So as an analytical term, religion is useless, right? For a single term that encompasses everything from ISIS to Quakers has got to do an awful lot of work. There is nothing that holds those two groups in common. And in popular parlance as well, in English, religion is often spoken with a bit of a sneer. It's not an attractive term. Worldview is better. It's also quite a modern term. It's worth looking at how it evolved. People used the Latin word religio for centuries and centuries and centuries. But in the Reformation in the 16th century in Europe, Europe was split apart, and you had Lutherans and Catholics and Reformed Christian groups, and they referred to themselves as religios. They were like confessional groups. And at the same time, the Western European nations started spreading across the world in the early days of empire building. And they came across things in India and China and South America and Africa that looked a little bit like the sects that they knew in Europe, because there was worship going on, there was a belief in God or gods, there was a moral code, and they thought, oh, this thing looks a bit like Lutheranism or Catholicism at home, and so they called it Hinduism or Confucianism or Buddhism or Taoism. Now, if you speak to people from those cultures, the idea that Hinduism or Confucianism is like this clearly defined entity in the same way as Lutheranism is nonsensical. Yeah. But Europeans started viewing the rest of the world through their lens, and they saw, there's that religion there, we'll call it Hinduism, there's that religion there. So even in the early days, it's a bit artificial. It's always doing a bit too much.
So they're united grammatically with this suffix ism. But actually the dividing points.
It's lots and lots of different human behaviour and beliefs and institutions and practices, and they tidy it up. They say, we're going to call it this and we'll put that label on it. That's
fantastic. Sam, anything to... I'm looking forward to the point where you guys will disagree on something, but I don't think we're there yet.
I'll throw in an interesting anecdote. I've often wondered, and maybe Nick can answer some of this, how Christians, Jews and Muslims and religions from all over the world would have understood the moon landing in 1969 to 1972. Humans, I apologise for any moon landing deniers in here, but there were 12 people who walked on the moon across 6 successful missions. And if you have a worldview that says everything I know and understand about the universe, I can fit within the framework of this literature, the Torah, the Bible, the Quran, whatever your literature would be, you'd go, okay, this book has all the answers. It's divine. It doesn't say anything about humans landing on the moon. So what do I do with that? Surely God would have foreseen humans traveling to another body, and we have the technology today, and some of it is in advanced development for people to go and colonize Mars today. What will religious believers make of humans living on Mars or living on the moon long term when it's not in their Bible or their Quran or their Torah? How will people understand that? Now, there is a group today, you may have heard of them, called Flat Earthers. And they are a rather interesting group of people who believe that the Earth is flat and that therefore we've never been to the moon or even been to space. I think I saw some data, interestingly, that says that the majority of flat earthers aren't religious believers. But that misses the very important point that flat earthism is a religion of sorts. Yeah, it's got the ism in it for a sort. So rather than sort of borrowing from another religious framework, it basically says that the world has to be this way, it is this way, therefore there are powers at work that are withholding truth or whatever. Therefore, any amount of scientific data you give me about the Earth being a sphere and the solar system being the way it is has to be a lie, because it doesn't fit within my framework. So that's just sort of an interesting take on the religion as a worldviews and how they incorporate science.
Yeah.
Just to pick up a little story on the moon landing. So America poured billions of dollars into the moon landings from the early 1960s, and they did that because of fear, because they were terrified by the fact that the Soviet Union had overtaken them in the 1950s, and the Soviet Union was the first nation to put a satellite in space. It was the first nation to put a dog in space. It was the first nation to put a human being in space. America had prided itself, it had won the Second World War, so why were we falling behind in the space race? The interesting thing about Soviet Russia was that it was on the surface of it a totally anti-religious country. So they had closed down tens of thousands of churches and monasteries. They'd killed tens of thousands of monks and believers before the war. And there was a policy of eradicating religion. And yet Soviet Russia, nonetheless, began to develop festivals and institutions and beliefs that were, for all intents and purposes, exactly like religion. So they preserved the corpses of Lenin, who was put on display and effectively worshipped. They had Octobering festivals that replaced baptism because they wanted to introduce people into the glories of the Communist Party. And then when they sent their cosmonauts into space, these people were treated almost like transcendent human beings. These are people who had achieved some kind of transcendence. It's a great example of, even in a society that stamps down really hard against religion, it still kind of appears in these weird formats in different ways.
That's really interesting. So we're trying to get towards this sort of definition of religion, and we've sort of unearthed the fact that you don't have to believe in God to have a religious mindset. So is it more to do with, looking at what you've just said about the Soviets, is it more to do with having a sort of protective reverence for an idea of how things should be? Sam, do you want to speak to that?
I think so. Because when I think about my friends who are very, very strong atheists with the reverence they hold to science, it is sort of the key gateway to truth, and so it's held with this special reverence. I think, like I said, I'll be very interested to see what happens when humans go back to the moon and go back to Mars. There is a sense in which any scientific data or advancement, when it encounters the worldview of a religious believer, there's some sort of how do I deal with this that goes with that. Yes, the religious framework for doing science in the first place historically, I acknowledge that completely. I'd agree with Nick. But I'll give you an example. I had a really bright young student from Oxford University who's a first-year undergraduate there, who is a Muslim, say to me, as a scientist, the Quran says the human heart is made out of clay, so it must be made out of clay. And I said, well, that's very interesting, because we know the chemical structure of clay and we know the human body. We've been cutting human bodies open for a long time. How do you deal with that? Because the human heart isn't made out of clay. And he said, I know because my holy book says so, that sooner or later scientists will discover that it is actually made out of clay. And I didn't really know how to answer that, because there's a very bright student going to Oxford University, but somewhere in there, his religious beliefs just could not accommodate science because of his attitude to scripture. And all religions are very capable of making that mistake. Not all religions. Religious believers are capable of doing that. Maybe you see a verse in Psalms about the sun rising and moving through the sky like a bride from its chamber, and you say, there you go, the sun goes around the earth. And you can rightly say that's a poetry book. That's poetry, it's song, it's not a scientific textbook. But people will trip over and make those mistakes. So I don't want to get away from the fact that somehow how you accommodate your view of the world can bring you into maybe not conflict, but border skirmishes with science, and that happens.
It's to do with different levels of meaning as well, isn't it? Whether it's literalism or more poetic meaning and truth. It seems, though, from what you guys have said, that initially, way back in the days of yore, science and religion were sort of walking along hand in hand along the same path. But at some point, at least in popular culture, there was a bifurcation, and they took very different paths and almost became tribal, or at least seemed to become tribal against one another. So Sam, we'll stay with you, and then Nick, you can jump on board in a bit. At what point did that happen, and what were the main factors behind that?
I think a lot of it is overblown by particularly the new atheists who enjoy looking back retrospectively, and certainly happened with Andrew Dixon White and the guys who are writing at the end of the 19th, early 20th century have given us a picture that's not true. A lot of it's overblown. I suppose you can look at. I think the Galileo affair is again has often been rewritten. I had an atheist tell me the other day that Galileo was burned to death by the church. Like, he certainly was not. That never happened. But let's take evolution for example. You have people like Asa Gray and Darwin's friend John Stevens Henslow, and a lot of theologians, religious believers, some who are scientists, some who are not, celebrating Darwin's discovery for solving a very significant problem in theology, which is how God, who is now a personal God that you believe is in touch with people and speaks to people and answers prayers and is close, is not really distant, is interested in people, and yet when it comes to nature, he pushes a button and then vanishes, and has nothing to do with nature at all. Now with evolution, you have as Asa Gray puts it, creation itself is infused with God's creative activity. And so you have now God who is involved in nature a whole lot more. But then you also have the debate at the Natural History Museum in Oxford with Samuel Wilberforce. You have the Scopes monkey trial. You have these flashpoints of people standing in the streets waving crosses, singing "Give me that old time religion," and singing songs about how we're not monkeys. So the flashpoints come, I think, partly because of the fear of the encroachment into my belief system, but also just very, very poor communication. I think a lot of the time that I'm not sure that really the church has always done a terrific job engaging with the sciences. So I'm sure Nick will disagree and have plenty to add to that.
Well, we'll see what Nick's going to say.
So I want to go back to this point about opposition isn't a problem. Okay, by far and away, the biggest enemy of science throughout history has been other science, right? Science progresses by disagreeing with itself. Scientists progress and develop by opposing one another. So we need to move away from the sense that any sense of opposition, any sense of conflict, any sense of tension is a bad thing. It's not. That's how human beings develop and progress in their knowledge. Now, there's a difference between legitimate disagreement and illegitimate disagreement, right? You can disagree with somebody for perfectly good reasons because you don't think their experiment is interpreted the right way, you don't think it's designed the right way, you don't think it's replicated in the right way. That's a perfectly good form of disagreement. Then is the kind of disagreement that says, I don't think your conclusions are right because they contradict my existing viewpoints. But if you're going to say that, you've got to say, well, why do you hold your existing viewpoint? What's the justification for your existing viewpoint? If you go back to the history of science and religion, when scientists start doing proper experiments at the end of the 17th century, they are pointless, right? And sometimes they're barbaric. There is an absolutely gruesome example of Fellows of the Royal Society, which still exists in London, the earliest scientific society in the world, keeping a dog alive and literally disemboweling it in order to see how its lungs worked. These look like, even for an age of cruelty to animals, these look like horrible experiments. They wanted to do so for scientific reasons, but people said, what is the purpose of this? There was another early experiment in which they tried to weigh air. Now we know that air has a weight, but in the 17th century, an experiment to weigh air looked absolutely pointless. Charles II described his Fellows of the Royal Society as my ferrets in a sack, because they were doing really eccentric things. They needed some justification to do this, and the justification came from theology, because the argument went like this. There's lots and lots of stuff in the Bible which says God, it can be seen in his creation, and by looking at God's creation you can understand something of God. And the Fellows of the Royal Society said, well, how much more can you find out about God by looking inside of creation, by opening it up, so to speak, as it were, and seeing how it works? And so this got natural theology, as it was then, a kind of a free pass. And you had these great scientists saying, actually, this is the kind of stuff you should do on the Sabbath, you should do on a Sunday, which was a radical thing for a Protestant to do, because a Protestant, you rest on a Sunday. And these people are saying you should do science on a Sunday. And some of them even said science is the kind of activity we'll be doing in heaven, which is a terrifying prospect for some people, but it showed how much value they put on it. So you go into the Enlightenment period, which is the period we all know in the 18th century where theoretically there's conflict there, and it's anything but. You have dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of books that are published saying you can understand what God is like through studying nature. And so in the 18th century we have this perfect harmony. But then in the 19th century, Darwin comes along and says, actually, everything you thought about creation, proving God's existence, doesn't work like that, because there's something called natural selection. And so all the Christian believers, or many of them, have put all their weight on this particular horse, so to speak, as it were, and Darwin comes along and says it doesn't work like that. So it's a question of where you put your kind of investment, where you believe the truth lies.
And Darwin became the influencer at the time, didn't he? He was the Mr. Beast of that era, and his legacy is still massive. So, Sam, where do you agree with Darwin, and where do people need to understand perhaps that he didn't get it completely right?
Well, I agree with Darwin on pretty much everything.
Okay.
The descent of man is a bit dodgy. I wouldn't agree with him on much of that. But no, I know some of the sort of more fundamentalists and the intelligent design people use the word Darwinism. I don't know anyone else, certainly not in the sciences, who uses the phrase Darwinism. There is no Darwinism.
It's that ism word again, isn't it?
Yeah. There's the evolution is not a religion. It's not a religious belief. It's a description of some scientific findings. You have ideas like convergent evolution that work almost as grand unifying theories across all of biology, everything from medicine to structural biology and genetics. So it's very, very important for biology, and it's a practical science now. It's a mathematical science now. I think a lot of people don't understand it. In fact, when I was doing biology at Cambridge, my professor said that evolutionary biology today is one of the fastest growing sciences there is, because of the data revolutions, because of what happened with the Human Genome Project, and stuff like that. So I don't see much disagreement there at all, and I think that the idea that there's sort of a warfare or a conflict between Darwin and his findings and religion is unnecessary.
I really don't think that AI as it is now is on a trajectory to becoming conscious, but it will certainly seem as though machines have conscious minds, and that's a danger.
If consciousness is a property of the brain, then it's subject to what we call causal determinism, physical determinism.
This idea of libertarian free will, I think, is entirely wrong, and I also think it's unnecessary.
These systems will become more and more like us. People will treat them and want them to be treated as though they're human. The challenge now is it seems to be going faster and faster.
We are terrible at projecting out long-term consequences.
Robot rights, I can see it coming.
So let's talk about where we are today, because we do want to go into the future of science and religion, and maybe talk about populating other planets and tinkering with the human genome. But where are we today, Nick? Where's the big conflict, and is it simply now only in the public perception?
So when I wrote this history of science and religion, the point I tried to make was this. Some people think that science and religion are trying to do the same thing, trying to both competing explanations for how the world works. They're not. Other people have said they're completely different. They're non-overlapping magisterial. Science does science, religion does religion. They have nothing to say to one another. Science does facts, religion does values. That's too neat and tidy. It doesn't work like that. I argue that they are partially overlapping, and in particular they overlap in this question of what is a human being. And historically it's kicked off between science and religion when either of them have said we have the total and exclusive understanding of what a human being is. Human beings are only mechanical creatures. Human beings are only evolved primates. Human beings are only genetics. And I don't think that's a fair assumption. But I think what's interesting is that today we have the ability to understand, to manipulate and to quote unquote improve human beings in a way that no generation in the past has. There are at the moment billions of dollars being poured in by the tech bros into radical life extension to help people live 120, 220 years plus. There's a lot of money being poured into the possibility of genetic medicine and genetic modification and genetic editing.
So we're not just here talking about Botox or a hair transplant. This is
we're talking
much more significant than that.
So yeah, so I mean, if you want to talk about life extension, aging is now defined not as something which is just natural, but as a disease, right? Not age-related dementia, but aging is a disease. So they're putting money into how you cure aging, and in one sense, it's just a technical problem. You stop cells getting old and dying, or you encourage the body to do what babies do all the time and younger bodies do all the time, which is repair themselves. By the time you get to 70, 80, 90, your body thinks there's no point in repairing itself because there's just too much energy. I've reproduced, from a Darwinian sense, there's no point. But if you change cells to what is known as, and Sam knows this much better than me, pluripotent cells, cells that can actually turn into any kind of bit in the body and then repair the body, there's no reason why you can't live to 120 or 220 or theoretically forever. Now that's a scientific achievement, it's a possibility. Who wouldn't want to live a bit longer? But then you get into this question, well, what's life exactly? Yeah. So you can live to 120 or 220.
You're pointing at me as though I'm going to. I'm not going to.
Almost definite, Andy. But what happens if nobody you know or love lives to that age? What happens if the entire world around you changes? So it invites a value question. What's the value we attach to life? Is it just the endless extension of the organism into the future? Or is there something else about life that makes it worthwhile? These are massive ethical questions that we're going to face. And they're the kind of questions that really demand philosophy and religious reflection.
And Mr. Coughing over there, Sam McKee.
Not going to live forever, are you?
No, I'm not.
Someone needs their genome editing, I think. Sam, you're in favour of this. This is where we're going to have some disagreement now. Because, Sam, you think this is a good thing. You want us all to live forever, Sam.
Well, I haven't given a lot of reflection to the aging thing, but I'm very pro genetic medicine. I'm very pro using these incredible new tools that we have with gene editing. It's a very exciting time. I think that some of the diseases and illnesses that have plagued humanity since its beginning could disappear. And I think that's a noble thing to do. And I think it's a Christian thing to do as well. When you look at the foundations of medicine as a practice, and the majority of hospitals in our country were built by religious people for this reason. I just sort of see it as the next extension. But I do agree that the questions that Nick's raised are very, very important, and they should be at the heart of all of it. And I think it's Alfred North Whitehead said that science inevitably moves in the direction of the worldview of the scientists. And so if scientists hold these worldviews that Nick has been talking about in terms of aging being a disease and death always being a tragedy, then you are going to have some of these problems. And I'd agree with Nick on that.
So I think the key question is where do you draw the line? So here are 3 examples. Huntington's disease, it's a monogenetic disease. It's debilitating, it kills you basically. And we understand why it's caused and we can do something about it. So there's eradicating life-limiting or life-ending diseases. And then a bit further along the spectrum, you have things that aren't goods, like blindness, for example. There's some evidence that some forms of blindness might be amenable to some genetic editing. Now, that's a good thing if you want to see, and genetic medicine helps you see, it's obviously a good thing. But blindness isn't a disease like that, and blind people are not a problem in society. And as disability groups relentlessly point out, it's not disability that needs to be fixed a lot of the time, it's society's attitude to disability. So that's a bit more kind of iffy. And then you go right to the other end of the spectrum, well, how about stupidity? I mean, this is not monogenetic, right? There's lots and lots of different things that feed into intelligence. But if, hypothetically, you could cure stupidity, you could make people more intelligent, should you do that? Now, there are plenty of people and examples in science fiction who say, yeah, obviously. But then you get into some really dodgy territory.
Well, because every science fiction utopia that we've ever seen or read about ends up not being utopian at all. There's always some black spot at the middle of it, and it's usually to do with human morality, isn't it?
And just, I mean, I mentioned earlier my first degree was in literature. Literature is great for exploring this. And so there's a British novelist called Kazuo Ishiguro who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago. He wrote a book recently, his most recent novel called Clara and the Sun, which is effectively about this. It's about, he doesn't quite spell it out like this, but it's a society where rich parents are able to genetically lift their children. They call it lifting in the book. But poorer ones aren't necessarily, and not all genetic lifting is successful. So you have children who've attempted to be lifted, but it's failed, and then they kind of slowly drift away from their peers. So the science is there, but then this wider question of should we do it? What are the social impacts of it? And that's the kind of thing you really need literature and theology to reflect on.
Yeah.
There are real world discussions around some of this right now. It's the instinct of every parent to give your children every advantage you could possibly give them. That's just instinct. We all want that for our kids. But if you have the money to employ some of these CRISPR startups, these gene editing startups, and you say, okay, I've got my IVF here, and I want to use gene editing to give my kids these advantages. You want to give your kids the advantages as well as all the not advantages, but the fuzzy areas, the fuzzy lines about I also want to choose their hair color and their eye color and their muscle mass and their, I want to make sure that they cannot possibly ever get these illnesses. You're now building a genetic upper class who have advantages. And that genetic upper class is driven by the rich who can afford to do that. That is a problem. That's a problem for society. You're using gene editing to create a new level of inequality. But also with that, it's a case of what about things like health insurance? So there's a gene we know about that people who have this particular gene, I can't remember if it's activated or inactivated, they can thrive on 4 hours sleep. I would love that. I would edit myself tomorrow to have that gene. It would be great to thrive on 4 hours sleep. And it's so simple. It's one of these, like Huntington's, a simple one you can knock out. But what if you're trying to hire people who operate heavy machinery or air traffic controllers? Should it be then a requirement or a prejudice against people who don't have that gene that they then are less desirable for that job? Do you see what I mean? You're now creating levels of inequality in things like health insurance. And just by what has been a positive for society is now creating levels of inequality. And those discussions are happening now, which is good.
So can I give one more example of that? Because they're great examples, and then the military gets involved.
Oh, yes.
And the military are always interested in this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So if you could genetically engineered soldiers, would you? Now that sounds like proper kind of Terminator stuff.
Or Universal Soldier with Jean-Claude Van Damme.
I've not seen that, or maybe I should. So there are some, I think it's reptiles, who have a kind of, basically a thermal vision, and it's been traced to a certain set of genes. If you could correct a soldier's genes and insert these kind of genes in them, and there is genuine active research being done on this at the moment, should you? Because thermal vision, who wouldn't like to be able to see at night? Or the other one, bioresistant soldiers. So considerable amount of military concern at the moment is on terrorist attacks using toxins, effectively. If you could engineer soldiers who are resistant to this, there are miniature microcellular organisms called tardigrades that are resistant. They're radio resistant. They show resistance to radiation. Now, if you could splice a soldier's gene with a tardigrade so it was resistant to kind of radioactive attacks, you've got a military advantage there. But should you do that? And if the other side do that, should you do it in response to them? These are massive questions, and they're all real ones in the 21st century.
And it seems like these conversations are happening now. These are no longer over the horizon of the next 100 years. We're having them now. And 25 years ago when I was at school, if I'd listened to something like this, I would have been absolutely petrified.
Well, no, because the technology exists now. And I think the general public, the gap between the general public's understanding of where the technology is in the biological sciences right now is quite big from where it actually is. I think biology is in its most exciting decade since the 1950s. And I've said that a number of times. But I think what's driving this even more is you have a number of converging lines of advancement in biology and chemistry all coming at the same time. So gene editing is coming at the same time as cheap, quick and highly accurate gene sequencing. On top of that, you've got developments like cancer immunotherapy coming along at the same time as gene editing. You have AlphaFold and structural biology, which will transform drug developments coming at the same time as all of these. So the grounds move very quickly, and it's just going to keep accelerating. It's a great reason to get into the biological sciences when you're choosing your A-levels or university courses, just to say. But because and this is a problem, I think, for science and religion, because if the science is moving so fast and the communication to the public is moving slower, well, then the theological reflection on it is going to go even slower than that, because the information isn't sifting through. There's a lot of theological discussion around artificial intelligence, but I think outside of Nick, there's not a ton that's happening around biology, or not the latest developments. So people of religious faith who are trying to understand the world with the rate at which science is moving right now have a challenge. It's almost going to catch them up unawares.
As we come into the last sort of 5 minutes or so before we hand over to some questions, we do want to ask about the potential responses from religious groups to something like this, because there wouldn't be in the UK today a single minister of religion who would say, oh, it's a shame that people don't get TB very often anymore. It's a good thing that we've got rid of that. In 100 years' time, I wonder what people will be saying. It's a good thing that no one gets old anymore. What are the possible responses that you envisage from different religious groups to this insane advancement?
So there are some examples that you would not want to emulate. So in London in the 17th century, people decide to cover the drains. Seems like a good idea, but there are some Puritan groups at the time say, well, you can't cover the drains because that way we won't know whom God providentially wants to kill. That is an example of bad.
I bet they were great at parties, weren't they? I bet they were so much fun.
Puritans were an absolute riot, that's right. The book I wrote on this is called Playing God, with the specific point of saying one of the objections you hear to this, most often with genetic engineering, is we shouldn't play God. That's nonsense. We absolutely should play God. We are, by definition, a God-playing species. We, uniquely of all the species on this planet, have a degree of rationality, imagination, communication, and ability to cooperate, which means we're basically here to play God. The question is, what kind of God should we play? Or to put it in more secular language, what's our ultimate value? What should we be aiming for? Is intelligence the thing we should be most proud of, most aiming for, in which case maybe we should genetically engineer for intelligence? From a Christian worldview, I would say it's love. It's the ability to give yourself to other people that's the most valuable thing we have, and that is not something that you can genetically engineer for.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Nick, but I'll just give two anecdotal, thought-provoking potential lines of disagreement. One is, now I forget his name, but there's a CRISPR-Cas9. CRISPR-Cas9 is the gene editing tool that the Nobel Prize was awarded for in 2019, which is like a pair of molecular scissors that allows you to cut, copy and paste genes, basically. And it's cheap and it's accurate and it's easy. I mean, you could do it in a lab in your school for just a few dollars. It's I remember Jennifer Doudna, who won the Nobel Prize for that, was asked a question that changed her position on ethics on this. Of, oh gosh, what have I done? I've just unleashed this on the world and now people can do anything. And someone said to her at a dinner party, I believe, the day might come when to have that power in your hands and not use it would be more unethical than using it. If you do have in your hand this incredible tool, and we've never had a tool like CRISPR, and CRISPR is now not the only gene editing tool that we have in our possession. There are even more accurate ones than CRISPR, which are, you could argue, safer. But to not use it for something like Huntington's disease, you could say would be more unethical than using it in the first place. So I think there's that question for a start. Well, if we have this power potentially for good, but it can and it almost inevitably will lead to a lot of bad as well, should you use it or not? I think there's still, my position is you should still explore what you can do with it for good. The other thing is there's one of the CRISPR startups in the US, and I can't remember his name, but he basically does a gene editing your baby company. He will take your eggs and you can use gene editing to say, I want this eye color, I want this hair color, I want them to be this height, and you know, I want to knock out the potential for these diseases, and there are these kind of quirks that I would like to promote and these that I don't. And I saw a fascinating interview with him, and he said, you know, future generations will look back at us as so barbaric as parents for just letting our children be a genetic roll of the dice. Let's just have a kid and see what they're like, or see what happens. Why would you do that, was his point, when I can give them advantages and I can choose the baby that I want? Because if they're the baby I want, I'm going to love them more. And I disagreed with him on that one. But he said future generation, 100 years from now, will people look back on us as barbaric for just letting our kids be whatever turns out, rather than having a directed hand in it?
And then it's a question of where you stop, though, isn't it? If you think about, you did literature for your first degree, you look at some of the greatest writers of all time, they had autism or terrible mental health issues a lot of the time. What if we get rid of that? Do we get rid of art and creativity? I'm not looking for you to answer this because we want to get into some questions, but it is just a question, as you said earlier, of where do we draw the line, and that none of this is simple. Can we give these guys a round of applause before we go into some questions?
You would call yourself an atheist?
I would, yes.
I would call myself a Christian humanist.
One of the big themes over the history of what we now think of as science has been questioning the exceptionalism of humankind.
I think the critical thing is what gives something value. Would you say that minds construct meaning or detect meaning?
I have had made from a little piece of my arm something that could reasonably be called a second brain.
I think one of the real challenges that evolution by natural selection puts to Christian belief is the idea that
Who's got a question?
Great question. The short answer is you shouldn't. You shouldn't. I mean, so the military is always doing this, and the justification of the military is if we don't do it, the bad guys will. But that is a nightmare scenario, because if everyone is always justified to doing something because they're afraid that somebody else is doing it, then you end up with the arms race. That's why regulation is so important for all this. We're talking about the future. There are basically two kind of approaches you can have for the future. There's a regulated approach and a market-based approach, right? The market-based approach is, do people want it? Do we want to get it before our competitors get it? In that case, we've got to invest in it. And there's been a market-based approach for a lot of this, not genetics, interestingly, so much, but AI certainly, for a long period of time. But then there is no ethical compass there. Then the only reason for me wanting to do it is because I want it. I might want a child with, you know, auburn hair or whatever, or I might want to have genetically modified soldier, or I might want to target, it's a nightmare scenario, target a particular vulnerable group through chemical warfare. I don't see that can ever be ethically justified, but the market isn't interested in ethics, it's interested in desire. It's what you want. A regulatory approach, which is messy and it's difficult and it's slow, asks those questions and says, we are able to do this. The critical question is, should we be able to? What are the ethical parameters? And an example like that, I can't personally ever see a legitimate justification for that kind of targeted warfare development.
In 50 years' time, do you think some of the things we're talking about now will have actually happened?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I'm an optimist. I'm also a futurist. So I tend to think with great excitement about where technology is going. I like sort of thinking about the frontier, and I'm an optimist with that. And I don't see that as having any conflict with my personal religious faith either. But no, the world, I think about how much biology has changed in 10 years, what it's going to do for medicine going forward. There are big questions for that, but there are also trade-offs, to address your question with that. I saw a cartoon the other day that was just nonsense. It was a picture of the atomic bomb explosion, and above it was Einstein's face with the letters E = mc squared. Now, Einstein did not discover general relativity with the aim of the atomic bomb coming about, and to lay the blame on Einstein for it is farcical. But there are trade-offs. Every time you open a box of new discovery, you don't always know what's going to come out or what people will do with it. People who think differently than you or are sometimes smarter than you will see something you haven't seen and will adapt it. But I still remain with that positive and hopeful, even though these advances in genetics are going to raise a whole bunch of questions. I think they're going to make the world a better place.
So we've got a question on the future of gene splicing. The more it happens, could we envisage some friction and feedback from Christian groups in particular, who would say rightly we are made in the image of God, and therefore to tamper with that is actually unbiblical, unchristian?
Can I defer to Nick on this one?
Yes, please.
So absolutely, it's going to happen. As I said earlier, it's going to happen sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad reasons. So you will get religious groups who will say, and not just religious groups, you shouldn't play God. And then they might say, you shouldn't play God because we're made in God's image, and by gene splicing, you're somehow marring that image. That is going to happen. That in and of itself, I don't think is a very good argument, because it doesn't really go very far. It just says, well, we're made in God's image. Okay, fine. What does that actually mean? That phrase has been used endlessly, and it's been used to justify almost anything. Now, I think it's a very helpful phrase, but you've got to then dig out what does it mean. One of the arguments, we're made in God's image, that's Genesis 1, it's a creative God. We're there to be creative, so actually we should be doing this kind of stuff. And there's another important point, it's always important to have the space for conscientious objection. So we have blood transfusion. Now, there are some religious groups that object to blood transfusion. I don't at all. It's kept my daughter alive for the last 5 years or so, but I respect the rights of certain religious groups to object on those grounds. So you will get those objections. You shouldn't just dismiss them, because I think for some people they can act with their conscience, but when you do get them, you've got to look underneath the bonnet and say, okay, what does this actually mean?
Yeah, and I'll just add that your genes aren't you. They're part of you. You are not determined or defined by your genome, and you are a complex mixture of networks. Your genome is one network, but your genome interplays with all kinds of other networks in your body. So yes, there is something to your question. That's certainly true, but I would be very skeptical with anyone who's like, oh no, you've completely done away with God's creation by editing the genome. There's a lot more to you than just your genome.
It's worth me saying, humans have been editing the genome for 7,000 years, right? The agricultural revolution was a massive experiment of genetic engineering. That's what we did. Domesticating, any of you got a dog or a cat, that is the result of genetic editing. That's what domestication is, effectively. So actually what we're talking about here is just a controlled version of that. Nothing wrong with it, just what's the objective, what's the ends?
If a household cat was our size, it would kill us.
Mine wouldn't, it's too lazy.
It would.
Yeah.
I'm telling you. You're supposed to be the scientist. Any other questions? That was a brilliant question and beautifully worded as well. Thank you. Okay, another amazing question about meritocracy. In the future, if everybody had been altered to be equally as highly intelligent, if the game, if you like, had been edited so everybody had maximum stats, what does that do for individuality? What does that do for progress, for merit?
So my answer to that is if humans were edited in that way, actually it would be the making of meritocracy. Because if we could guarantee we all started from the same starting line in terms of our intelligence, our strength, so on and so forth, then the only difference that would make in our life would be how much effort you made. Because you're not cleverer than me, I'm not cleverer than you, so our end result will be down to our effort. The problem is that actually the idea of us all being equal, I mean, we don't even know what intelligence is. So the idea that you can say everyone can be equally intelligent doesn't make sense. Equally strong, well, you know, a 6 foot person, 5 foot person, men, women, they have different natural strength levels. So those differences will always creep in no matter how we try to engineer ourselves. So in theory, it could be the making of meritocracy, but ultimately human beings are different. And really important point, that's a good thing. Right? We aspire to a degree of equality in society quite properly, but we are different, and that's kind of what makes life interesting.
I look forward to finding out.
So the question was, make sure I understood it right, by trying to limit disability, would we be able, okay, it's a really good question. The words like illness and disability are subjective words, right? So I've got disability. I've got really, really bad eyesight, -10 or something like that. But society is such that, you know, we have ways of correcting this. There are some disabilities. My brother has epilepsy, which isn't a genetic condition, but it's a developed condition. And epilepsy is an absolutely wretched condition because it gives us unpredictability in life, and when you have seizures. Now that is the kind of, David would definitely say that's a disability. If we could correct that, you know, people with epilepsy do live full and happy and positive and contributive lives, but it's in spite of the epilepsy rather than because of it. So I think that in some instances there is a very strong argument to remove these disabilities. You've just got to be really clear what kind of disability you're talking about. You know, there's a famous legal case a few years ago of a deaf couple who wanted to make sure their child was born deaf. Now, for a lot of people, why would you inflict that on your child? Their argument was, we're happy, we're functioning, we contribute to society, we have a different perspective on the world because we're deaf. Deafness is not a disability in the same way as epilepsy might be. So I'm personally for eradicating or limiting those life-limiting conditions. You've just got to be so careful about trying to understand what actually is a life-limiting condition.
Yes, it's such a big question in terms of where we draw the line with these things. Again, on the genetics side of things, you know, Huntington's disease, Tay-Sachs disease, those diseases that give you a very painful existence and then kill you before you're 40, I'm very hopeful and excited at us getting rid of those. But there's a really terrific film everyone should watch on gene editing that features Jennifer Doudna and all the top players in it, like George Church, called Human Nature, and you can see it on Apple TV, I think, and things like that. And as part of this film, they follow a boy who's going to be one of the first recipients of a gene-edited blood transfusion to help him with his sickle cell disease. And it's fascinating looking at how this makes his life really difficult because he loves basketball and he struggles to play basketball with having what he calls a sickle cell episode. But right at the end of the film, he's asked the question, do you wish that this treatment had come out before you were born so that you wouldn't have had to live with sickle cell? And he says, no, absolutely not. It's helped make me who I am. It's helped form my character. It's given me an appreciation for life. And I was quite surprised at his response. But he's not the only person who gives that response in the film. So there are things that I might look at as a scientist and say, we got to get rid of that. We got to sort that out. That's a disability and illness which is just brutal for life. It's just harm. And yet you talk to more and more people who have suffered in those shoes and they have a very different response. And I don't fully understand it, but I do appreciate where they're coming from. So I hope with your question, which is a great question, that the conversations around this can keep going forward to help us formulate where that line should be.
Just adding to that, disability rights groups are really good on this, right? Because up until, almost within my lifetime, the basic principle has been, well, society will tailor society for people who are normal, right? And disability rights groups, well, hang on a second, that means we're the problem and we've got to fit into society. And thankfully in the last generation or two, people have pointed out the fact that basing societal norms on what is normal for people actually merely serves to exclude people who are not normal. Sometimes the onus is on society to adapt to people who are different, rather than people who are different to adapt to society.
So, going back to the question about meritocracy, if we edited things and people in a way that there was much less suffering, how would that affect people's desire to, if you like, step up from the gutter?
So it's a really good question. I would push back on it personally. I would challenge it for a number of different ways. Firstly, we today live in visions of material paradise and health that were unimaginable even 100 years ago, even in this country. 100 years ago in this country, I'd be dead. The life expectancy for a male was in late 40s or so. Child mortality has come down, infant mortality has come down, longevity has gone up to late 70s, early 80s. So we, in a sense, we do live in a utopia compared to what it was like in late Victorian Britain. But people still make an effort, people still work hard, people still do jobs. I don't think people make that effort simply because life is rubbish for them. I actually think there is quite an intrinsic aspect of human nature that we are, inherently, we want to be creative and productive, we want to do stuff. Certainly in the working life that can be channeled to some awful, boring jobs, but I think actually the urge for us to work and be productive is natural. It isn't as a result of adverse circumstances. And the second point I would make is that whereas we have done really well in terms of addressing a lot of the physical ailments that have affected humanity for a very long time, we're not doing great psychologically, mentally. In fact, arguably we're doing much, much worse. And mental ill health is increasing in very, very comfortable societies in Western Europe and America and so on and so forth. And it does seem to be a problem with human civilization, that having defeated a lot of the things that were killers through history, smallpox, tuberculosis, plague and so on and so forth, we have almost by design brought on a whole host of others that are affecting us negatively. So I personally, and this is probably where Sam and I might differ, I'm not an optimist. I mean, I'm vaguely hopeful sometimes, and I fear that humans have an almost infinite ability to screw things up for themselves.
Well, you can't argue too much with that. I would just only add that I think people find a lot of their meaning from work, in terms of their purpose and their inherent sense of value and worth and meaning. A lot of it comes from what they do. I mean, this question can be applied to robotics and artificial intelligence. Great, robots can do every single job that humans do. Humans don't have to work anymore. Life is perfect. What will we do? I think sort of the same question comes up. I'm one of those people who just can't stand the thought of ever retiring. I want to be doing something, and that's just because a lot of meaning comes from the work that we do. So I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
Just one kind of a PS to that, you might come across Israeli historian, very popular author Yuval Noah Harari. Now he has written about how the AI revolution is going to change everything. It will make mass unemployment, and he's on record as saying that people's real challenge will be to how to fill their time. My best guess will be a combination of drugs and video games, which sounds absolutely ghastly. I don't think that's going to happen. But nor do I think that humans will ever be satisfied in a life of not working. Leisure we like, but unemployment just destroys us psychologically and emotionally. And I think any government worth its salt in the future, if it ever finds itself faced with the prospect of mass long-term unemployment will not be in power for very long. People want to contribute.
So are you fearful for the progression of technology and maybe some of these advancements falling into the wrong hands?
My answer is yeah, absolutely. And in one sense, you guys, your generation is better able to answer the question than I am. So my kids are 20 and 18, so they were smartphone generation. I mean, that's kind of marked their teenage years massively. The correlation between the development of the smartphone and mental health problems among teenagers is absolutely indisputable. I mean, there's a really strong connection there. Now, the smartphone is not in and of itself a bad thing. So I think there are two things to worry about here. There's the worry of actually good technology falling into people's hands. And there's no malintention there, but just without regulation, just sacrificing all to the logic of the market can end up having negative effects. And then there's the wider problem of, well, how about technology falling into the hands of malign state actors? So a great example here is China. I've only been to China a couple of times, I don't know much about it, but friends I know who've been there say that they increasingly operate a social credit system whereby how well you behave or not is effectively measured. All purchases are done virtually, and so it's very, very easy for the state to control your behaviour, because if you start protesting against the state, you can't purchase your groceries. Now that might be a bit dystopian, but the capacity for state actors to use technology to control their populations is enormous and worrying.
I'll just add to that, however confident you are in world leaders and how much you like them, it's equally as much, given how cheap something like CRISPR is, and given how it's the nerd in their garage or the rogue scientist in their lab that could do a great deal of harm that is concerning as well. What's to stop the one scientist in their lab just going rogue and trying something out because they want to, and then being able to sell it for a great amount? That's a concern as well. It's not just the world leaders. So yes, I am concerned. And
actually, that's already happened in 2018. This Chinese biophysicist He Jiankui announced to the world, initially on YouTube of all places, that he had genetically cloned two twin girls to be resistant to HIV. Interesting example. No one was objecting to the fact that he was trying to engineer a medical response to HIV, but the fact that he did it completely unregulated, more or less in his own lab, that is worrying, and it caused the global genetics community to sit up and say, this technology has progressed very, very quickly. We can't risk this kind of thing happening.
Yeah, it did. I remember being at uni at the time, and they shut down our lessons for the day for us to have a class debate about it. It was did the mother know what was being done to her kids? Her consent was very dubious. I'm certain she didn't understand all the biochemistry of CRISPR, just sort of did it. This scientist just said, I'm just going to edit your babies before they're born. It was completely shocking.
And the critical thing there is, Sam will know much better than me, that was a germline modification. So it's a modification that is then passed to your children and to their children and to their children. So it's not a specific intervention on one person. It's a change that then ricochets down the generations.
Yeah, really wild.
Any more?
Yeah. Do you have any concerns amidst these genetic advancements for natural biological evolution, for example, new resistant viruses coming into play?
It's happening all the time anyway, and nature never stands still. There's always pathogens out there. A great example is the problem of antibiotic resistance. Will be one of the major challenges to humanity over the rest of the century. We are running out of viable antibiotics, and we have overused them, and we have mass produced them so much. We've used them with cattle and stuff like that. It's not just ourselves. Are we going to go back to the days, as our antibiotics stop working, are we going to go back to the days where you have to cut off a limb, when you have an infection to save a life? I hope not. My personal hope is that we can use stuff like CRISPR to engineer even better antibiotics. And there are people I know who think, well, in a pound of soil, you've got enough tools to work with to solve antibiotics for life, and that they're more optimistic than I am. And I hope so. But yes, there are natural phenomena coming down the line, that's serious problems that we need to solve for human health, that I hope your generation gets working on it and solves them for us.
That is a good example of this. It's a natural phenomenon, but it's also a human capacity to screw things up. Because actually, what's gone on there is, Sam pointed out, it's ludicrous overuse of antibiotics that's causing this. It's a natural phenomenon, but it's also our ability to mess things up that's behind it.
But sleep well at night.
That brings us to the end of today's debate. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. As always, do you have questions that weren't answered today? Well, why don't you let us know? We'd love to hear from you. Visit us at premierunbelievable.com. Do get in touch. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please give us a follow. If you're watching on YouTube, please press the like button, hit the subscribe bell. Thank you for joining us today. Until next week, from me and all the team, goodbye.